Hi. Sorry I couldn't be here today. Hopefully, Ella will be better by tomorrow. Poor little peanut. Okay, so today we need to talk about cellular respiration. We took a look at the mitochondria yesterday so that we at least understand the different parts of the mitochondria. And that's necessary because we are going to discuss that cellular respiration is a pathway, and it happens in 3 parts. And those 3 parts happen in 3 different places. And so that's what we're breaking down today, are the steps of cellular respiration. So cellular respiration, the process of turning food molecules, and we're going to focus on glucose. I do want to make a side note that it isn't always glucose. Our body does, our mitochondria do have ways of modifying other food molecules that make it into the mitochondria so that they can also go through this same process. Glucose, however, is the most common food molecule, the one that gets that our body uses the most. And so a lot of our food gets converted into glucose before it makes it to the mitochondria. Remember, we talked about how the whole digestive process ends in our small intestines, and then those tiny, tiny molecules, they're so small they can just absorb right into the bloodstream. So these are really small molecules. They're small enough to absorb into the bloodstream. However, we're going to learn that glucose is too big to just go right into the mitochondria. All right, so first let's take a step back and let's look at the overall reaction, because this is something you will definitely have to know. You're going to have to understand that cellular respiration is the process of taking glucose plus oxygen and turning it into ATP. That's our main goal. And then carbon dioxide is the waste product that leaves our body. And then water will get reused by the cell, but it's a waste product of this reaction. I do want to point out respiration. We think of respiration as breathing. And I always say this, that we breathe because we eat. And here's why. The reason that we inhale oxygen is because it requires oxygen to make ATP out of glucose. So we inhale oxygen, that oxygen gets brought down to our mitochondria, is used to make ATP, and then the waste product carbon dioxide is toxic to our cells, so it needs to get taken out right away, and it gets taken through our bloodstream to our lungs. So our lungs are more like a doorway, our doorway to bring in the oxygen for this process and get rid of the carbon dioxide for this process. So we breathe, the reason we breathe in oxygen and exhale carbon dioxide is because of breaking down glucose to make ATP. All right. So cellular respiration, very similar to photosynthesis, is a series of chemical reactions. And we call that a pathway. And this works similar to a relay team, where the products of one reaction get handed off, kind of like the baton gets handed off to the next runner. Well, the products, we go through a series of reactions, then we make we go through a chemical reaction. The product at the end of one chemical reaction gets taken to another chemical reaction where it's the reaction, or the reactant, I'm sorry. So let's just picture runners in a relay. We've got the starter. The starter has the baton, and that's the reactants. And then the gun goes off, and the runner is running, and we consider that the chemical reaction for that runner. And that runner gets to the end, and now his baton is the product, and he hands that baton off to the next runner. Now for that runner, it is now the reactant. It's the beginning of this process for him. So he takes that baton and he takes off running. That's his chemical reaction. And at the end of his chemical reaction, the baton is now the product, and it gets handed off to the next runner. And that's kind of the way a pathway works. And so cellular respiration just like photosynthesis, is also a pathway, a series of chemical reactions. And we're going to talk about how cellular respiration happens in 3 steps. Glycolysis is the first step, then the Krebs cycle, and then the electron transport chain. And I just want to point out that I have a time limit on my recording, so you might have to push pause to keep up with the note taking. Maybe not, but just keep that in mind. I'm not trying to rush you, I just have a time limit. All right, so cellular respiration, although cellular respiration, we know we've been kind of leading up to the idea that cellular respiration happens in the mitochondria. The mitochondria is the energy factory. It's where we build ATP. But it begins in the cytoplasm. So just imagine we're in a cell, and that cell, here, let's take a, I just want to give you a visual. So I'm going to take us out here for a second. So here we are, we're in a cell. Let's particularly take a look at this one. Okay, so glucose, we've eaten it, it's been broken down in our small intestines, it gets to this cell. Now, it makes it inside the cell, but it hasn't entered the mitochondria yet. We aren't in the mitochondria, so we're in the cell, we're in the cytoplasm, but we are not in the mitochondria yet. So we're in the cytoplasm. And we call this first step glycolysis. Now, glycolysis literally means glyco means sugar, and lysis means to split. So glycolysis literally means to split the sugar. And so I always imagine this as glucose is a relatively large molecule compared to a lot of the molecules that get used during, sorry, I just saw something. Glucose is a relatively large molecule compared to like carbon dioxide or oxygen or other things that are going in and out of a cell. So I always think that, glucose is too big to fit into this little mitochondria. So we start out with glucose. Remember, it's a 6-carbon molecule. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And that's because glucose, if you remember, and I'm not going to put the subscripts, but it's C6H12O6. I don't have time to put the subscripts. That kind of makes it look pretty rough, doesn't it? But, C6H12O6. That's a little better. Anyway, we're focusing on this C6 because carbons are the most important part of this molecule at this point. So we have 6 carbons. Well, it's too big to get in, so we split it. When we split it, it turns into 2-pyruvate. Pyruvate. So each of these 3 carbon molecules, they're made out of 3 carbons, is called a pyruvate. Now they're small enough to get into the mitochondria. All right, so then once we've finished glycolysis, so here we've turned glucose into pyruvate, now it's small enough to fit into the mitochondria. It does go through some other little reactions. We don't have to know those, but we take those products and we bring it to the matrix of the mitochondria. So remember, the matrix is this space in the middle of the inner membrane. And so now inside the matrix is where the Krebs cycle is going to take place. And the Krebs cycle is very, very similar to the Calvin cycle. in photosynthesis. It's a whole bunch of chemical reactions, and in this case, the main purpose of the Krebs cycle, its main goal, it does make a little ATP. Do you see that in the picture? It's showing you all the products. We get a little bit of ATP from glycolysis, but mainly we're breaking the molecule into pyruvate so it can go into the mitochondria. In the Krebs cycle, here we do make a little ATP, but the main goal of the Krebs cycle is to extract a whole bunch of electrons to supply the next step of cellular respiration. Remember those high energy electrons? Okay, we need that energy to build ATP. But remember, they're too high energy. They're kind of like these rogue, scary little electrons, and we need to control them. We need to contain them, or they're going to be very damaging. So once again, we have electron carriers. So how do those electrons get to the electron transport chain? Well, they're transported using those carriers, and this time they have different names. Remember, in photosynthesis, it was NADPH. I always remember that the P kind of sticks with photosynthesis. We take the P out for cellular respiration. And in this case, we have two electron carriers, NADH and FADH2. So here's what they look like without the electrons, NAD+, FADH+. And then once they're loaded, so they come to the Krebs cycle this way, and they leave the Krebs cycle this way. Now they're fully loaded with electrons. And now we're going to take all of those electrons. We make lots of these energy carriers. They don't show you in here, but I think if I remember off the top of my head, that we make 8 NADH and 2 FADH2, and each of those carries 2 electrons. That's a lot of electrons that we're taking into the next step, into the electron transport chain. So if you look up at this picture, we've got those 3 steps, remember? Here we break the sugar so it can make its way into the mitochondria. Here we're going to take that pyruvate and we're going to extract, we go through a whole bunch of chemical reactions, and we extract as many electrons as we can. Now we're going to take those electrons to the electron transport chain, and this is where we make a whole bunch of ATP. Here we've made like 2 ATP, 2 ATP. Over here we're going to make 34 ATP. Alright, so the electron transport chain is a series of proteins embedded in the cristae. Remember the cristae when we were talking about the parts of the mitochondria? There are these like little peninsulas that stick out toward the outer membrane. So on these little peninsulas are the cristae, and that's where we have all of these proteins embedded, and those proteins act like an electron transport chain. So as the electrons pass through the chain of proteins, we call this process chemiosmosis. And this is where lots of ATP are made. And I want you to write this down. They make up to 36 ATP. Now, it's not always 36 ATP. Sometimes it's a little more, sometimes it's a little less. All right, so here is, I'm running out of time, so I'm going to have you push pause to finish filling out this part. Remembering that protons are another name for hydrogen ions, and that chemiosmosis uses a proton gradient. In other words, we build up all the protons in this intermembrane space, and then they get forced through that last protein. And all that energy is used to build ATP.